Good morning, Suzuki Science, grade 12s. So this lesson this week is relatively short compared to everything else that we have done. We have looked at a lot of very large concepts, and we're still in homeostasis, as that is, for many of you, one of the more interesting parts of the grade 12 biology curriculum. And we've talked about the thermoregulation, we've talked about osmoregulation, we've talked about endocrine system and endocrine control through homeostasis. We talked about nervous system and nervous control in homeostasis. And we recently talked about stress, which was a nice combination of many of the homeostatic measures that we've talked about, everything I just listed. And this week you have your task that is due. Your task is going to be looking at how the homeostasis, both how it affects you specifically, and you'll be using some kind of a graphic, comic, some kind of product to demonstrate that understanding. And I'll talk about that momentarily. This week we're looking at circadian rhythm. And I like talking about circadian rhythm because so many of you, your sleep-wake schedule is completely abnormal. We would normally have a situation where you would sleep for 8 hours and be awake for 16, but for many of you, and you'd sleep at night from maybe 12 to 8 or 1 to 9 or something like that, but many of you have completely shifted your circadian rhythm and your clock. So before I go into the details of the circadian rhythm, I want to share some anecdotes with you. So here is a Kenneth Parkes case. This one's interesting for many reasons. It's local. You'll notice it says City News here at the top. This occurred in the Greater Toronto area. So as you scan through here, what you'll see is a situation where this son he got into a car, he drove from Scarborough to Pickering, and he took a crowbar, I believe, and he bludgeoned his parents-in-law to death. And when he went to after this was done, he turned himself in at the police station, and after this was all done, he was acquitted because the doctors said that he was not awake. He was sleep driving. He was doing all these actions while he was sleeping. So that leads to some very interesting questions. What exactly is the difference between awake and asleep? And hopefully after this lesson, you'll have a better understanding of how in the world a person can supposedly be asleep, get in a car, drive 20 kilometers to another person's house and kill them, and then be said that they were asleep while they were doing it. Some other things that are interesting as an anecdote. You'll see in this book called The Nocturnal Brain. And some of the areas that make the understanding of homeostasis fascinating is when we look at the disorders associated with them. So with endocrine system, when you look at goiters and you look at diabetes, people look at the diseases, and in an effort to understand the diseases, they have to understand the systems that are not working properly. So the same thing goes here with sleep. And some of you might have experienced a few of these. Delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. So some people say, I can't get up in the morning. I can't get up in the morning. I can't, you tell your parents, I can't get up. And in many cases, it's simply because you've shifted your circadian clock, your hormones are kind of out of balance, and you're just not sleeping properly. But for some people, they actually have a disorder that prevents them from waking up at the proper time when the sun rises. Nonce 24 sleep disorder. So this is where your clock is no longer working on the 24.2 hour cycle. So our biological circadian clock that's entrained by sunlight and a lot of other hormones that go through a various cycle, it's on a 24.2 hour cycle. But for some people, their clock becomes disconnected from their the environmental cues that say you should be sleeping for you should be awake and asleep for 24 hours. And so what happens with them is they might wake up, or they might have a 25-hour or 26-hour or 28-hour cycle. And so over a period of months, they will sometimes sleep during the night, but sometimes they'll sleep during the day, and the whole thing shifts. And there's some people have been diagnosed with these various sleep disorders. It's more common, as you see here, in blind people than it is in sighted people. The most common, the ones that are most talked about, the ones that they make fun of in TV, are the non-REM parasomnias. And so these include things like night terrors, sleep talking, sleepwalking. So I don't know if you've ever been to camp or had a bunch of family over, and someone that you have in your family or as a friend, they just start talking in their sleep. They do it constantly. And sometimes you can even try to carry on a conversation with them. It doesn't often make very much sense. And sleep eating. Some people have been diagnosed with, they wake up at night and they're sleeping, but they go to the fridge and they just start eating. Some people eat things that are completely wrong. They'll eat like bricks of butter, or cereal with that's soaked in orange juice, or something that is you would never do while awake. So some people will eat and drink while they're sleeping. And all these disorders can be explained if you understand how the circadian rhythm works, how the hormones control the body, how they control the brain, how they control REM sleep versus awake versus non-REM. If you understand those mechanisms and those words, then you can understand why these things might occur. REM sleep behavior disorders are, I guess, to be compared versus the non-REM. Both of them are sleep disorders that can result in abnormal behavior. And in this case, it's during your REM when we dream. And so you just imagine what would happen if your body wasn't paralyzed during your dream state, which is what happens, one of the things that happens during sleep. You're having a muscle atonia, it's called, where your muscles are basically disconnected from your brain, so you don't act out your dreams. But in some cases, this sleep-wake disconnection doesn't happen properly, and you'll have people who will talk, yell, punch, kick, get up, walk around, and do other things, eat, drink, while they are sleeping. They're not completely awake. So the REM and non-REM sleep disorders have similar characteristics depending on what it is. They have different mechanisms as to why they work. Restless leg syndrome is a common disorder of sleep, and it is, as you can see, described on the screen here. All these things, if you're more interested in them, I encourage you to do a little bit of a search. Another one that has been played out in TV shows, sitcoms, and movies is Sleeping Beauty syndrome. The organization that supports this doesn't really like that name. We understand it because when you say Sleeping Beauty, we think of a person who's been sleeping for way too long. And so Klein-Levin syndrome is a true syndrome where some people, because of a abnormal sleep-wake cycle, they sleep excessively. So this neurological disorder is characterized by recurring periods of excessive amounts of sleep. And during that time they're awake, their behavior has been altered, and they have this disassociation. The word is called derealization of the world. It normally strikes adolescents, and often they'll grow out of it. However, when they are under the control of this KLS, then they are incredibly drowsy for the day and the night, for days, sometimes weeks at a time, even longer. So you imagine going through life trying to deal with that kind of situation. And these have very specific biochemical underpinnings. If you're trying to understand biology, you need to understand biochemistry. They believe that this happens to be an ion channel disorder, where there's a gene that is not allowing a particular ion channel to work properly, leading to KLS. All right. So the last thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to explain how the sleep-wake cycle works in the brain. Most of the information you'll pick up from the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint has been designed in such a way that you can step through it and understand the various parts. So I'm just going to go through this. You can read through this. It talks about the body clock, circadian rhythm, and what's happening. Right. So I encourage you to kind of look through that. A lot of these I've lifted from various sites and put it together for you. Sleep occurs in several stages. So we recognize that the sleep stages, that there's two major categories: REM, rapid eye movement, and non-REM. And non-REM has 3 stages. So that makes up your 4 stages. And you can identify what stage a person is in by looking at the brain activity. If you connect the brain up to a special electroencephalograph, then you will be able to determine what stage of sleep they're in. During the night, we cycle through various stages of REM and non-REM. So in a typical night, you'll have increasingly longer, deeper REM periods. But if you don't sleep enough, then those deep, long REM periods won't happen, and that affects your mental health and your overall physical health as well. So in stage 1, the non-REM sleep, it's a changeover when you go from wakefulness to sleep. So when you have those non-REM disorders, you can imagine what's happening, right? You're supposed to be transitioning to sleep, but sometimes things don't work properly. During this very short period, we're talking about several minutes, of very light sleep, your heartbeat, breathing, eye movement slow, your muscles relax, and you get some occasional twitches. You can often see a person falling asleep. That's during non-REM. Your brainwave patterns, as you can see in the diagram there, they begin to slow from your daytime wakefulness pattern. Then in the stage 2, the non-REM sleep is a period of Stage 2 non-REM sleep is a period of light sleep before you enter the deeper sleep. Your heartbeat and breathing is slow, muscles relax even further, your body temperature drops significantly, and your eye movements stop. Okay? So you spend more of your repeated sleep cycles in stage 2 sleep than any other sleep stages. Stage 3 non-REM sleep is the deep sleep you need to feel refreshed. And it occurs in longer periods during the first half of the night. And this stage of sleep is incredibly important for you to get the good night's sleep, quote unquote. And then we get to REM sleep. So this occurs in the first 90 minutes after falling asleep. Your eyes move very rapidly, hence the name rapid eye movement. And your brain waves, your mixed frequency brain waves, become closer to what you see when you're awake. So if you look at a person in REM sleep and you look at a person in wake, the brain patterns look very similar. Your breathing increases, your heart rate and blood pressure increase, and this is where the majority of your dreaming occurs. Okay? During this point, your muscles in your arms and your legs are paralyzed, which helps you not to act out your dreams. We also believe that memory consolidation occurs during this stage as well. So this non-REM, REM sleep is important for you to remember things. Something else I don't talk about in here is one of the reasons why we sleep, we believe, is so your brain can clear out all the toxins from the day's cellular activity. And in a system called the glymphatic system, which is a relatively new system that's been discovered that works in your brain during sleep. So I encourage you to kind of work through this, take a look at the different parts of the brain. You'll see that there's parts of the brain we've talked about, like the hypothalamus, of course, is responsible for almost everything to do with homeostasis. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, I'd mentioned way back at the beginning, it is the area that's responsible for receiving information about light, and therefore when it's light or dark, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is able to then send signals to other parts of the brain to say wake up or go to sleep. The brainstem allows the hypothalamus to control those transitions from wakefulness to sleepiness, and GABA is one of the things I'll talk about. It's a major hormone that causes sleepiness. versus about 7 hormones that are implicated in wakefulness. The thalamus is the relay center. All sensory information comes through the thalamus and then gets redirected to various parts of the brain. Melatonin is released by the pineal gland. The pineal gland receives signals from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and when it's dark, it activates the pineal gland to release melatonin, and melatonin makes you sleepy. Some people will take melatonin 4 to 6 hours before they fall asleep when their sleep cycle is not working properly, hopefully in hopes to entrain their sleep cycle back to normal. But that's not the only thing that determines whether or not you're going to be awake or asleep. There is the sleepy hormone, melatonin, and then there's the wakefulness chemical known as adenosine, which we've seen in adenosine triphosphate and CAMP, cyclic adenosine monophosphate. So the adenosine is a chemical that's released it builds up as you're awake. So the longer you're awake, the longer the adenosine, more adenosine that's released. When the adenosine is released, it causes you to be tired. So at the beginning of the day, when your adenosine levels are very low, you're super bright, super ready to go. But as the day progresses, you release more adenosine, and the adenosine levels go up and up and up. And as they go up, you have a sleep drive. You feel a need to sleep. And this sleep drive works in combination with your other hormones, the circadian clock. It's a major part of the circadian clock. And as you get to a point where there's so much of the adenosine built up, you have to sleep. You have no choice. Many of you try to trick your body so that you don't sleep at a particular time because you want to stay awake, you need to do some work, you need to study, who knows what it is. And so you might take something like caffeine. And the way caffeine works is it prevents you from sleeping by blocking the adenosine actions. When you do this to your body, what your body will typically do is it will just grow more receptors for adenosine. And so the caffeine that you were taking once upon a time does not work as effectively because you have more receptors. So you take more caffeine and it ends up being a vicious cycle. I encourage you to watch this video. This video will tell you much about the circadian clock, and I have shown you this video once before near the beginning of the course. There are many hormones and chemicals throughout your body that undergo a circadian rhythm. So I want to bring you to these 2 hormones, melatonin and adenosine. Melatonin is the sleep hormone, so as you sleep, more of this is released. As you get towards wakefulness at the beginning of the day, the melatonin levels drop and you wake. Adenosine is part of the sleep factor that is low when you're awake and is high. When it's high, you feel much more sleepy. And so 12 to 16 hours after you wake up, the adenosine levels have peaked and you feel a strong urge to sleep. And generally it takes about 8 hours to get rid of the adenosine levels. And if you sleep the 8 hours, the adenosine levels are down to minimum, then you wake up bright and happy. Well, you wake up alert, we'll say. Okay, so as you look at this chart here, at the beginning of the day, here we are at 7 a.m. And at 7 a.m., you'll notice the adenosine levels are low. But as you stay awake, the adenosine levels go high. You have this circadian rhythm, which is a combination of cortisol and melatonin and other things. And at the beginning of the day, you are awake. And the hormones and various chemicals allow you to be alert. But as the day progresses, those same hormones and other chemicals that's in your circadian rhythm, they begin to dwindle. And your adenosine builds up. And so you end up with this big discrepancy between the sleep drive and your circadian rhythm. So at this point here at 12 p.m., 12 a.m., 1 a.m., you are tired and your body's saying, let me sleep, or 12 to 16 hours after you've woken up. But an interesting thing happens when the sun shines. So many of you, if you've pulled an all-nighter, you're really tired, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, but then the sun starts to rise and suddenly you feel you get this extra burst of energy. And that burst of energy is your circadian rhythm clicking in. As the light comes in and the suprachiasmatic nucleus recognizes that light, it inhibits the pineal gland, the melatonin is no longer released in the same form, and other things happen, which I'm going to talk about with the drawing, and you end up with you have less of a distance between the sleep-wake urge. However, as the day progresses and your circadian rhythm continues on its downward spiral, as you lose that energetic splurge of energy you got at the beginning of the day, you'll end up with an even greater urge to sleep because the adenosine's still building up. It didn't get purged. And then that's when, at some point, you're going to fall asleep. If you don't sleep, there's some, I encourage you to Google it, find out when's the longest period of time that someone's gone without sleep. But if you don't sleep for a certain period of time, it is fatal. You have to sleep. So I'm going to encourage you to work through the PowerPoint and learn all about circadian rhythms. I've talked for 20 minutes, and in that PowerPoint, I want you to learn about the circadian rhythms. I'd like you to learn about the different parts of the brain responsible for sleep. I'd like you to learn and understand that how light and darkness control or help to determine when you're going to be awake. Understand the role of melatonin, understand the role of GABA, understand the role of hypocretin, and maybe a disorder or two that's related to the sleep-wake. Understanding why you might have something like a sleep paralysis where you are awake but you can't move your body. I just talked about how during REM your body's paralyzed. So if you're at sleep paralysis, that means you're waking up too early. You're waking up in the middle of REM. At the end of REM, your body relaxes that inhibition of your muscles and you can move around. But some people wake up when their muscles are still paralyzed and they're unable to move. Night terrors, and there's common motifs that you'll see where a person might wake up and they can't move and they see this figure at the end of their bed. That's a very common symptom of certain types of sleep disorders. So it's not just something that you have, it's just a manifestation of how your brain is dealing with this waking out of sleep, but not completely. Or if your body is shut down and you are sleeping, but you're kind of awake and your muscles are working, how you can move into the sleep talking, sleep punching, and there's some other very odd, that I'm not going to talk about, sleep disorders that frequent the medical journals as well. So I'm going to diagram the brain and talk about the sleep-wake neurotransmitters and kind of explain what happens when one of them doesn't work properly. Narcolepsy, if you don't know, this is the one where a person might be completely alert talking to you, and then if it's narcolepsy with cataplexy, narcolepsy type 1, then suddenly all right, assuming you've gone through the PowerPoint and you have a rudimentary understanding of how the hormones control sleep, I'm going to talk about the neurotransmitters. So I'm trying to connect the various concepts of homeostasis into this one concept here. So the brain. Our brain clearly is responsible for everything that we're doing. And inside our brain here, we have a number of regions, and we have a lot of neurotransmitters that are released. It so happens that we have a group of neurotransmitters that include norepinephrine, that include serotonin, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, you've heard those all before, histamine, and acetylcholine. And where I'm drawing them are not where they are in the brain. And all these neurotransmitters, they are responsible for us being awake. So when we're awake, these neurotransmitters are released and they will stimulate the various regions of our cortex, right? So the cortex will be stimulated. So they come into the cortex and they stimulate all sorts of things. And these are typically coming from the hind midbrain area. So they stimulate the brain. So if these are released, we're awake. And so, as you can imagine, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is going to somehow innervate these regions of the brain and they'll activate the brain. Now, we also have a hormone, a neurotransmitter associated with sleep. and that is GABA, right? So GABA. So when GABA is released as a neurotransmitter, what it will do is it will inhibit all these regions of the brain. So this one neurotransmitter can affect all these other neurotransmitters, inhibiting them. And so once GABA is released, it inhibits these neurotransmitters, and they are no longer promoting wakefulness. All right? And then we have this third type. We call them hypocretin neurons, hypocretin producing neurons, and they will innervate the same regions as the GABA. So the hypocretin, as we understand it, is in the thalamic area, so somewhere in the thalamus, and they will innervate all these regions. So where GABA inhibits these wakefulness areas, right? So black being wakefulness. So GABA inhibits it, so that's sleepy. And hypocretin, it innervates these wakeful areas. So hypocretin is one of the areas of the brain that, well, responsible for keeping you awake. So it innervates these neurotransmitter releasing cells and causes them to release their neurotransmitters, which then activate the cortical, subcortical areas of the brain. Now, as long as the hypocretin is releasing, then it's stabilizing and promoting wakefulness. Cells also directly innervate, a big arrow here, we know this, directly innervate muscles and areas of your brain responsible for REM. So the hypocretin will cause your muscles to be active, right? And if the hypocretin gets affected now, so let's say we affect, something does something to the hypocretin. If the hypocretin stops working, then you no longer get the stabilization of your serotonin or your norepinephrine and some of these other neurotransmitters. And since they're no longer being stabilized and stimulated to work, then the serotonin and norepinephrine do not get released, and therefore you no longer have the inhibition of sleep. So it's kind of backwards, right? The serotonin and norepinephrine, what they can do is they can inhibit REM areas of the brain. So as long as serotonin and norepinephrine are active, your REM is inhibited. But once the serotonin and norepinephrine are inhibited themselves, then there's no longer inhibition of those REM areas, and then you go into REM. Also, when the hypocretin cells are compromised, then these muscles that have been stimulated, they will no longer be stimulated and they'll stop working, which we see as cataplexy, where the muscles just stop working. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to explain to you how the concept of narcolepsy, type 1 or type 2, might occur very simply, narcolepsy. So a combination of GABA, which inhibits these neurotransmitters that all are responsible for wakefulness in some way, and hypocretin, which stimulates those wakefulness neurotransmitters. When we start looking at the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so if we have the eye in this region over here, and as that nerve comes in to the SCN, and then the SCN has, like, it's a whole cascade of interconnections between what's happening with the brain, light, and those neurotransmitters. Right? So the light comes into the eye, it goes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which in turn stimulates other parts of the brain to release antidiuretic hormone, cortisol releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary to release adrenal corticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal gland to release cortisol and the glucocorticoid, which says, okay, let's start recruiting sugars and let's start waking up and getting ready for the day. So there's a circadian rhythm that's associated with melatonin release and cortisol. So cortisol release happens early in the day so that we have energy to do our metabolic functions, and melatonin is reduced because we need to be awake. As the day progresses and we get to nighttime, the suprachiasmatic nucleus then tells the pineal gland to release melatonin, which makes us sleepy, and as you go through the day, your cortisol levels drop. And so we get this interplay between cortisol and melatonin. Depending on your age, the release of melatonin and cortisol is stretched over different amounts of time. You'll notice that very young children sleep much more than teenagers, for example. Okay? And as we look at the interplay of these hormones, you'll see that there's other hormones like leptin and ghrelin, the hunger hormone, where you should be hungry as you wake up so that you will provide your body with nutrients and energy so you can make it through the day. So many of the hormones, many of the neurotransmitters, many of the chemicals throughout our body are connected to the circadian rhythm. In molecular genetics, I had you in metabolism, I had you identify very specific clock proteins, so clock genes that produce proteins that were controlled by circadian rhythms. So the transcription of certain genes are associated with the circadian rhythm. And when it's daylight or nighttime, certain genes are turned on, which cause the production of certain proteins, which cause the reaction of your body to do something. So it's really quite complex. You don't need to know the complexity. I'm just showing you this diagram so you have some idea that the overall concept is complex.